We know it's Tuesday morning, and Tuesdays are made for football archaeology here on Pigskin Dispatch. Tim Brown joins us in a special edition of a release of his new book. Tim's up in just a moment to tell us all about it.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darin Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
One of the greatest elements of the game of modern football is the passing game. But it didn't always seem to be that way because it didn't always exist in football. Now, Tim Brown of Football Archaeology joins us here to tell us about a new book he has out about the early passing game, the 1906 to 1915, with his new book that's out. And before we get into the interview with Tim, let's make sure you hit that like button and subscribe button so you can get more of what we have going on here at Pigskin Dispatch with some football history with every Tuesday with Tim Brown and all of our other great podcasts and YouTube channel specials that come out and pigskindispatch.com. Now, let's go on with our interview. Tim Brown, our guest that's every Tuesday from Football Archaeology, has a new book out, and we're going to talk to Tim about this great book. And Tim, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Darin, good to see you and chat again. And I must say, I want to thank you for being one of the 2 or 3 editors who took a look at an advanced copy and commented and helped me make it better than it was. So thank you. Definitely appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure to read your work, and even when at the very beginnings, and to help, and as you helped me out so many times on my writings too. So, and I'm sure everybody else that contributed really enjoyed it too, because it's another great piece. Well, I guess let's not keep everybody in suspense. Why don't you tell us what the title is and a little bit what the book's about?
Sure. I will display the cover here. It's When Football Came to Pass. So it's kind of pulling on a biblical reference, though it doesn't really have much to do with the Bible. But that's kind of just thought it was kind of a good title. But
it's actually a brilliant title it really tells what the book's about.
Yeah. Thank you. So so the gist of it is, a couple of years ago, I decided to do this football archaeology series. So I was trying to find, kind of isolated topics, if you will, within football history that I could write books that are 100, 150, 200 pages, cover one thing, cover it deeply, and then, move on to something else. And so, just kind of thinking about, in my mind, if I looked at, or if I thought, okay, what are the 2 or 3 most important rule changes in football history? One of them, it's either the top 2 or the top 3, is the forward pass. And, the other 2 were so foundational in the early 1880s that it's like you can't even imagine football without those 2,
Mm-hmm.
And so, meaning, the possessions and downs and those kinds of things. And so, anyways, the forward pass is such an integral part of the game. It dominates the game today. It defines the game. And so this is just an attempt to look at a little bit of how did it come about, but mostly once they said, okay, we're going to have this thing called the forward pass in 1906, what did the first decade look like? And it was a strange period. We can look, people look back at all history, even their own personal histories, and we try to make sense of it. And we tend to put logic on events that weren't logical. We try to make things make sense and establish patterns. But the first decade of the forward pass was a mess. The rules were not well thought out. They were substantially different than the passing rules today. And, they were trying this and it was like, they were cooks. They were, Walter Camp and the boys were trying some stuff, trying to see if it would work. And a lot of it didn't. And so it was just a strange brew. And, but it was a lot of fun doing the book just because I went into it with certain assumptions. I assumed it was a much more logical, straightforward process than it was. I knew the rules were very restrictive, but it turned out that there was a lot of very strange things that happened during that first 10 years.
Yeah, and you use that as your subtitle. You're talking about the period 1906 to 1915, and very, very instrumental in football history. And most of us that don't listen to this show or read football archaeology don't know much about it. And so it's a great period of time to look at. Now, what do you think? Because you talked about it many times. You talk about it in the book that the forward pass that we know today is probably not what the forefathers envisioned it to be. What do you think was their envisionment of what they want the forward pass to do?
Yeah, so if you kind of, I mean, it's hard to do, but I mean, I try to immerse myself in reading,
Mhm.
what was said at the time, right? And yeah, I mean, I wasn't there. All I can do is read, the printed word, from what people said. And so I really think when they first put the forward pass in place, and I cover this, in the book, that they were thinking of it much like the illegal forward pass. So, in football, in rugby, and hence in football, you could not throw the ball you could not throw the ball forward, so toward your opponent's goal. You could toss it even with where you are and backwards, but not forward. And if you did so, it was a loss of possession. And so, but and just inadvertently or maybe on purpose at times, people threw forward passes throughout the history of rugby and football. They just did. I mean, typically it was a mistake, but they did it. And so it wasn't a strange thing. It wasn't like nobody knew, what was going on. People threw forward passes. They just got penalized. They lost the ball, they lost possession as a result. But most of those where they were just tossing it to a guy, 3 yards, you know, to the side and a little bit in front of them. And so when they imagined the forward pass as being this new thing and allowing it, I think most people viewed the forward pass as this very short pitch to somebody a yard or two in front of them. Now, there were some people who were a little bit more visionary who said, okay, well, you might be able to throw this thing further downfield. Um, but, it was just a way they thought you could open up the game by being able to toss it in front. Some people thought you could toss it in front beyond the line of scrimmage. I mean, there were a lot of different variations that, people talked about, but mostly it's got to be thrown behind the line of scrimmage. And that's kind of the way as the rules were formulated in 1906, that's the way they went with it. But most people entered the season, the 1906 season, basically not knowing what the heck to do. I mean, they'd never done this before. They'd never thrown the ball forward. That had been a prohibition. It was like you can't run out of bounds and come back in with the ball and continue running. It was just such a
Mhm.
basic rule. But now we said, okay, we can violate that rule, right? And so it took some imagination to figure out how to make that work. And so one of the things was that people, I walk through and document 9 different ways that people threw the forward pass. I mean, the throwing motion. You know,
Hmm.
we think because we've been throwing the forward pass for 120 years, so we think that everybody would always have thrown the ball using an overhand spiral, but that's not what happened. Early on, they used a bunch of different techniques, several of which were variations of the overhand spiral, but others were just kind of uh, bizarre ways of throwing the ball. I'll mention one just because I put it in. It's been in a tidbit in the past, but you know, some people toss the ball on a forward pass like a soldier would toss a grenade. Stiff arm over, from kind of over the shoulder, head and shoulders, not and then there were a whole bunch of other variations. And the reality was that There really was only one team in the whole country in 1906 that threw the ball using the overhand spiral that we know today and did it effectively and consistently. And that was St. Louis University, and who doesn't even play football anymore. They haven't since 1949. And so, the reality is that there was a lot of opposition to the forward pass. There was constant pressure to eliminate it during the first decade of its existence. And so had St. Louis U not figured out how to throw the forward pass and then publicized how they did it to the nation, um, it might have gone away. You know, there are rules, that goofy little things that happen in football history that we look back upon and go, wasn't that stupid? Wasn't that silly that they did that? And we might look back now on the forward pass as this crazy experiment that they violated a fundamental rule back in 1906, and then they finally gave it up in 1909. Well, that's not what happened. We've continued with it, but it could the forward pass could well have gone away if not for St. Louis U, Eddie Kokums, their coach, and Bradbury Robinson, the primary passer on that team. So, you know, he, as far as I'm concerned, Eddie Kokums is the father of the forward pass, and were it not for St. Louis U, who knows? We could all be communists and be playing some other game today.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you make great points. Bradbury Robinson is no stranger to being connected to the forward pass in history. But and I've read, many variations of that story in many different publications. But in your book, you bring a little bit more to it, the story, bringing Coach Kokums into it, which many people have never heard other than listening to you talk and or
Yeah.
reading your work. And so you shed great light on it, and you preserve the history in a great way. But the forward pass, and you explain it very well through the book. It was not an easy thing to do in 1906. There was some very restrictive rules and
Yeah.
really a punishment for throwing a forward pass. Maybe you could explain that a little bit.
So football had restrictive rules back then. I went into this research. When I start a book, I go into it not knowing the answer. I assume I don't know the answer. I assume I will find new things. But I found a lot of new things in doing this book. And so, I knew there were restrictive rules. I wasn't entirely clear on exactly what they all were. But so, but there were several that were, fundamental. So in 1906, if you threw a forward pass that was incomplete, it was a turnover, just like it had been if you'd thrown an illegal forward pass in the past. If you then in 1907, they changed it because they found to be too restrictive. They changed it to a 15-yard penalty. Okay, that's pretty still restrictive. They had you forward passes that were tipped. So they hit a player and were dropped, or they hit a defensive lineman and dropped. They were live balls. They treated a tipped pass as a fumble. And you couldn't throw the ball and have it cross the goal line. Yeah, there were other rules of that sort. You had to throw the ball from either 5 yards to the left or 5 yards to the right of the center. And then in 1910, it changed. You had to throw it from 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. And that stayed in place until 1946. So, I mean, there were just a lot of restrictions in place.
Now, how did that work? Okay, let's say you decided to use the grenade throwing style, like you said, in 1906, and you threw a pass down, it goes, 10, 15 yards downfield, and so it's a turnover. Where does the defensive team get the possession at? Is it at the
It's
previous spot, or is it
from the spot of the pass.
spot of the pass? Okay, so it's not like a punt where the
No,
the,
yeah,
the ball ended. I mean, you throw from your own 5 yard line, the other team's getting it from your
yeah.
5 yard line. Okay.
On the other hand, if somebody touches the ball in flight, then it's a live ball and it's treated just like a fumble is today. So,
Okay.
yeah, so there were a lot of restrictions, but I think But really what I learned and what I write about is that a lot of the challenge was just the it was as much a challenge of the organizations and the imagination. So like again, we know how to pass block. We know that today. We figured that out. They hadn't. You know, at the time, linemen could go downfield anytime and they could block while the ball was in the air because the rule makers didn't anticipate the need for a pass interference penalty on the offense or the defense. So, there were plays designed for people to run downfield, get in this circle of linemen and catch the ball because they were blocking the defenders. So these just crazy plays we can't imagine today, but they made sense under the rules of 1906. And they hung around for a while, especially in the East where they were very reluctant to give up their power running game. They had been national champions and dominated the game and all this. And the East was just really a very traditional approach. And it really took until, the big game in 1913 when Notre Dame beat Army by passing well and running well, that it kind of opened people's eyes and said, we better catch up with this stuff because, we're going to get our butts kicked.
Now, do you think that's sort of the aha moment for acceptance of the forward pass in football? Is that 1913 Army Notre Dame game?
Yeah, so I think that moment is overdone. Not so much from an East Coast standpoint, but certainly, in the Midwest and and elsewhere, like Oklahoma and places like that. Um, it was, the Eastern teams. There were some Eastern teams that passed well. Carlisle for sure. I mean, Pop Warner at Carlisle was one of the true innovators. What's now Springfield College, what was then the YMCA school in Springfield, Massachusetts. They were very innovative in passing, but they were, you know, they were they neither team was as big time. I mean, Carlisle pretty much was a big time team, but they weren't Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Penn, right?
Mhm.
So you're not really anything if you were not one of those four. And so, and those guys basically stuck to their knitting until like 1913 when, I mean, they all tried it here and there, but they never committed to it. And I think a lot of it was they used this graduate coaching model. And so, you'd have one coach, you'd have the guy who was captain the previous year would be the coach that year, the following year. And he wasn't going to risk his reputation by doing all the stupid forward passing stuff. They stuck to the knitting. They followed the plan. They followed the Princeton way or the Harvard way. Harvard was a little different because they had, Percy Haughton was the coach from, I think, 1908 and on. But he was not a forward passing advocate, so he didn't like it. He was trying to get rid of it all through the first decade. So, so yeah, it was, there was a lot of opposition and, it's like, football wasn't like today. You didn't have, uh, kids weren't on campus all summer running plays. That, they, and coaches showed up 2 weeks before practice started, if that. So it was much more of just a part-time thing. Pop Warner was a lawyer. He lived elsewhere most of the year, and then he'd show up a couple weeks before camp, and and he was dedicated. So so basically, the places that relied on the graduate model and kind of run of coaches were in and out, they tended to really struggle with the forward pass. The schools that had the most success and dedicated themselves to it were the ones that had professional coaches, and Warner being one of them. But there were others. I mean, Yost was not a big proponent, but he was a long term. He's a professional coach, and he did some things too. So again, there were some others here and there, the Springfield guys, and Cokems at St. Louis U was professional coach, a couple of others, Bernie Owens a little bit later on at Oklahoma. So, here and there were those guys, but
Yeah.
you know,
So what do you think? Okay, so 1912 was a big year because of rule changes, and that sort of helped probably the 1913 game because of the rule changes. What do you think were some of the items that kept the forward pass alive from 1906 through 1911? 'Cause
yeah,
everything was going against them. The rules, the East Coast teams, like you just said, most of them didn't want to have anything to do with it. They wanted to go back to the old ways. What kept the forward pass in the game?
yeah. So one of the really funny things is that if you read the newspaper articles of the time, they will talk about the forward pass and how exciting it was and how great it is, even for teams that only threw it 2 or 3 times a game.
Mhm.
So, like in the Harvard Yale game of 1906, Yale throws a long forward pass that sets up a score that wins the game, right? And so that play was just touted and touted and touted, but it used just a crazy technique. It used that whole run down and circle the receiver approach. I won't talk about exactly how they threw the ball. You can buy the book and figure that out or read about it that way. But there were um, the fact of the matter is that fans liked the forward pass. The players liked the forward pass. Coaches maybe not so much, because they had, I mean, you only had so much coaching time, and now you have to develop this whole new set of stuff, and you don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to throw the stupid ball. So, I mean, that's a real challenge, and we can't, it's hard for us to conceive of being in that situation because we know how to throw the ball, right? But
Mhm.
if you've never seen the overhand spiral, and most people in 1906 had never heard of the darn thing, if you've never seen the overhand spiral, you're probably not going to try that in your play, when you're in practice, and it wasn't easy to throw given the size of the ball at the time. So, there's just a lot of factors that came into play. And I really think, in 1913, one of the things is that the guys who were seniors in college in 1913 that was the first class that had played their entire career under the forward passing rules because they were freshmen in high school in 1906. And if they, went straight through, they were seniors in college in 1913. And so, football and all other sports have a sorting process, and you find guys who have particular talents, and you say, well, you're big, you're going to go over to this position, or you're fast, you're going to go over here. You can throw the ball, you go over here. So, um, you know, there were situations and individuals. Jesse Harper, who was the coach at Wabash in 19, well, he went there in I think 1909, but in 1911 and 12, he had a guy who could throw the ball, and he used them. And then he goes to Notre Dame in 1913. He had Gus Duray. So he said, "This guy can throw the ball. I'm going to use him." So you needed a combination of coaches who were willing to throw the ball, could conceive of plays and blocking patterns and etc. to throw the ball, and you needed a guy with the talent to do it. And there weren't many of those combinations early on. And so, but Notre Dame had that in 1913, and they went in the Army and knocked their socks off. And, you know, the press noticed, and, uh, and a couple other things happened later in the season that, that reinforced the idea that the forward pass was something that people needed to pay more attention to on the East Coast.
Yeah, I think maybe as I read the book and as you're talking about right now, I sit there and I think about watching a forward pass now, and maybe it's just me, but there's just something magical, when you're watching your favorite team or you're watching any game on there, just the anticipation of that ball being loose in the air, and it's got your full focus. You're watching it, and there's something magical about it. Not that running plays aren't fun to watch too, handing up. But there's just something different when a
Yeah.
quarterback steps back and releases that ball and you don't know what's going to happen or where it's going, you know, maybe he does, and then everything that transpires after that. There's something cool about that. I think
Yeah.
that's maybe caught the magic back then too. Do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. And so, back then you got to remember that, the most offenses, it was basically they were running goal line offense the whole field. You know, tight formation, closed formation, everybody inside the ends, and the ends are right next to the tackle. I mean, foot to foot. And um, you know, it was just like it. I mean, it was fun to watch, I guess, if that's the only thing you've known. But then when somebody all of a sudden starts throwing the ball, that's exciting stuff. I mean, that's why punts were so, we always talk about it. The punting game was so big back then. Well, part of it was because it was fun.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, punt returns are fun now. That's why Canadian football is so fun because they return every punt. Here
Hmm.
we fair catch all the time. And so, it's, you know, if you saw 3 or 4 forward passes a game, that was a big deal. That was fun. And then St. Louis U shows up and they're throwing 20 or 25 a game. I mean they didn't do it all the time. So they ran well, so they were perfectly happy to pound it down your throat. But they'd throw the ball and they did it well.
Yeah, well, you not only talk about the aspects of the game's rules evolving and learning how to throw the ball, the nine different ways, but you also have to look at other aspects. People had to figure out how to get in position to catch the ball and how to defend the pass, and all
Yeah.
these different elements that spun off of this rule that really have changed all aspects of the game. And I think you did a really nice job of that. And you used so many diagrams and illustrations and little stories of fact that happened with real people and these guys that preserved it. I think that was very interesting how you researched that and displayed that in the book.
Yeah, I mean, one just little illustration is that the term pass blocking, we all know what pass blocking means today. It's some kind of a process where the offensive line and maybe a back or two protects the quarterback when he's throwing the ball. But pass blocking until into the 1930s meant knocking down the pass. It was a defensive term, you
Mhm.
know. And so it kind of tells you how little attention was paid to pass blocking. And most passing plays came off. They were what we would now call play action. That term didn't exist then, but I use it in the book that way. Um, because that was, that was the way you had to protect the quarterback. You needed you play action and misdirection was kind of the only tools you had, you know, because you couldn't use your arms, couldn't use your hands as a blocker. So, you tried to hit somebody and then they ran right on through, and quarterbacks were, or, tailbacks, whatever position they were under pressure all the time. So, and the passing restriction or passing statistics reflect that, they weren't very good.
Yeah. You know, during our conversations when you were writing the book and I was giving you some feedback and others were too, and you probably asked this question to multiple people. You asked it to me. I was maybe 2, 3 chapters into it, and you asked me a question. How much of this is new information to you? And I told you at that point, I said, maybe 25% or something like that. It was a small amount. And as I got more into the book, and this is somebody that reads probably a book on football history every single week. Yeah, I'm always into a football book. By the time I got to chapters 4 or 5 and beyond, I wrote back to you and I said, "Hey, I changed my mind. I knew nothing going into the book. Everything that I knew was maybe in the first, the Bradbury Robinson part of the story and some of that. But this is really a book that's never been written before, stories that have never been told before, or else they've been forgotten. And you've rekindled that and brought new information to folks that know a lot about football. And I think that's really something special.
Yeah, and well, thank you, but I think you also just like you read my stuff, right? And so when I was first doing the research on this, I wrote some things about using these crazy techniques. And, so you were familiar with some of that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, whereas, somebody who doesn't necessarily follow me, I mean, I didn't know this stuff, right? So, and if you haven't gone back into the archives and read the old newspaper coverage and the books, Yost's 1905 book and stuff like that, you don't realize how confusing a time it was and how difficult it was to figure out how to throw this stupid ball. But the reality is that that was one of the biggest challenges, was just how to throw the ball in a way that went for distance with speed and accuracy. So those three things, other techniques gave you one, maybe two, but only the overhand spiral gave you all three.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. It's great the way that you portrayed it, and tell the story of this first 9-10 years of the forward pass and all that transpired on there. And this is it's coming up into the holiday season, and folks, I'm telling you, if you have anybody that has any inkling of liking the game of football, this is probably a great stocking stuffer, or a gift to give to your father or something like that. Because it's really an easy read. You can read it in a day or two, and you're going to learn so much information that you didn't know before. And so Tim, why don't you tell folks where they can get a copy of this and the title of the book again?
So basically, the book is available on Amazon. And because it's available on Amazon, you can also get it through like Walmart and Barnes and Noble and stuff like that. There are some people who prefer not to buy it that way. And so I've had a couple people reach out to me and just say, hey, can I just buy it from you directly? And so, I'm happy to do that. But basically the first place to go, just, search when football came to pass, and you'll find, multiple online opportunities to buy the book. And if you're a digital person, you can buy the digital version. If you're an audio person, it's available on Kindle audio. It's also available on Audible. And yeah, so that's about it.
Well, Tim, you did a great job on it, and you've added, I've added it to my collection of Timothy P. Brown books that are here by my desk as reference points to go to, and I'm sure many others around the country are doing that the same. And we appreciate you writing a book.
I need more people to do that. For
okay, sure. Yeah, that's always as an author, right? So, yeah, so definitely appreciate you preserving this piece of football history and coming on and sharing it with us, giving us this interview with you to talk about the book and for letting us be a part of it. And we really appreciate it.
Well, appreciate you having me on as always. And hopefully it results in good hits for you too, to have this interview. So.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.